Hi, welcome back to Sustaining Creation, a faith journey for small groups. Now, by this point in time, after all we've covered, you might feel a little bit of despair. You might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed. You might even want to go back into bed and pull the covers over your head. You're probably questioning, with all that we've covered, if there's any hope for our kids and our grandkids' future. Well, welcome to the second half of our series. And we're going to show you, we're going to talk about why there's yet reason to hope. Even given all that we've talked about, there's yet still hope. So in this session, 3A, we're going to talk about the hope that arises out of the new technologies that are being discovered, as well as cooperation on an international level. We're going to talk about what's happening. But let's start with a little scripture. Probably the favorite one that feeds my ministry. It's a parable, of course. Jesus always wraps difficult truths in a parable. So let's go to the Gospel of Mark, 4th chapter. Jesus is telling this to his disciples. Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on the rocky ground where it did not have much soil, and it sprang up quickly since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it and yielded no grain. Other seed fell into good soil and brought forth grain, growing up and increasing, yielding 30, 60, and 100-fold. And he said, let anyone with ears listen. So it's too easy to fall into our despair, to be that seed that fell among the thorns or in the rocky ground. And yet God is calling us to be that seed that bears fruit. So we're going to look at technologies. We're going to go into some slides to show the amazing progress that's happening across the globe. New technologies that harness the sun and the wind and the waves and the heat that's in the earth. Technologies that are based on living with in harmony the way God created the earth and the universe. Wouldn't that be neat? So we're going to look at those technologies and why there's reason to hope. But we're also going to look at the international cooperation that's going to go on. So we're going to look at some time with the Paris Agreement and other agreements, and we're going to look at why this is basis for hope. So, wipe off those concerned frowns. Throw that blanket off your head. It's time to engage based on hope. It's time to be the seed that yields 60, 100-fold. Come on, we can do this. So we're talking about hope in times of, well, they just look desperate when you look at all the news, but we're talking about there's a reason for hope, and it's rooted in the new technology. Actually, the one thing that's been really stunning over the last couple of years is just how fast the new technology of renewable energy has developed. Every day, if you follow the news, every day there are new breakthroughs. Every day countries are making advancements. Every day we're seeing the change from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And the reason is because we finally come to the price point. We're breaking the price point where even if you don't count the cost of all the pollution, all the health, all the deaths that's caused by burning fossil fuels, even if you disregard those costs, renewable energy is now cheap enough to be competitive. When we harvest the sun and the wind and the water and the waves, renewable energy is now able to compete with coal, oil, and gas. And it doesn't cause the deaths, it doesn't cause the harm. And so if we look at the early predictions, they were off by an order of 10 or 100 as to how fast wind would come about, as to how fast solar would come about, as to how fast batteries would come about. That's where we're at right now. We're at a really exciting time. The technology is breaking through because we've broken that price curve. We've broken that price curve. And so we can go back and look at what were the predictions 10 years ago or 15 years ago and find out that we've exceeded them 10 times, 20 times, 40 times, 100 times. We're on the edge where no matter what politicians, no matter what fossil fuel interests are trying to hold us back, the renewable energy is going to happen. That should give us hope. It doesn't mean we have an easy road ahead of us. It doesn't mean that the fight isn't going to be hard, but that should give us hope. You know, there's a story in the book of Revelations in the 21st chapter where Jesus is proclaiming that, see, I make all things new. Wouldn't it be something if this breaking through this?
I guess I'll emphasize again how important it is for religious communities to be actively involved in the work of democracy and the call to care for creation. If it's just up to the mainstream environmental groups, that is way too small a constituency to move the needle the way that we need to right now. And that's just from a practical standpoint. If we want to live in a future world that honors the greatness of our Creator, it's just never been more important for religious communities to speak up for what is.
But every time one of my daughters is out in the woods, she finds things. You know, she sticks her head in these flowers, and she says, "Dad, come smell these," you know, and or "Dad, look at what I found." And she has a caterpillar, or even when we go fishing and she catches a fish and helps me take the hook back out and put it back in the water, or holding a frog, and "Dad, look at this, look at what we've got." And, you know, can we touch it? And they look at it, and it's just this wonderment. And it's beautiful because, you know, walking through the woods, I might be looking at my watch or cell phone, somebody calls, and I might be tempted to think about what it is that I got to do next. And they're always pulling me back to, right now, look, Dad, look, don't miss it. I mean, it makes me want to tear up. Yeah. Don't miss it, because it's all around you. And they always bring me back to that. I think, wow, you know, this is how I want to see the world. They show me through the eyes of what I think God made us this wonderment to see. And they don't miss it. And they call me back to it. And that's a gift. I mean, that's a gift that I treasure. And so, but they see it. And so I think, that's why I always think getting families, getting individuals, getting old people, get out into walking, rowing, cycling, whatever it is that you do to be out in the world that God has made and experience it, feel it, exert yourself in it.
We're in Washington, D.C. It's our generation that is witnessing the end of the era that we're involved in. My generation has done what no previous generation could do because they lack the technological power, and what no future generation will be able to do because the planet will never again be so beautiful or abundant. Our generation has destroyed the life systems of the planet because we had the technology to do it. Previous generations didn't have that technology. Future generations won't be able because they're going to be struggling to simply survive. Why? Because the planet will never again be so beautiful and abundant. Those are words that could make you cry. And he cites that since 1970, when I was 20 years old, 40% of the plants and animals, individual beings, not species, have vanished from the face of the earth. It's all a question of story. We're in trouble right now because we do not have a good story. We are in between stories. The old story, the account of how we fit into it, is no longer effective. Yet we have not learned the new story. Next up is a Telling It Forward segment on a specific action item that we would like you to include in your discussion today. It's one of 6 that you should be discussing, but it's going to go deeper into this one to give you an idea on how the other 5 might also be looked at. Don't neglect the other 5. But for right now, sit back and take in the truth of this one. Let's take a couple moments and focus on a particular action item. You're going to look at all 6, but this one I want to call out to you because it's a little bit unusual. It's number 17, and what does it say? It says, skip the Christmas presents and use the money instead to help a poorer family save some energy this year through improving their home lighting or their home insulation or their weather stripping. Yeah, there might be some pushback from your family on that. We've been doing this for a number of years now. We started, my wife and I, just with ourselves, where we no longer gave material Christmas presents, but acts of love and acts of compassion. And we rolled it out to our adult kids, and we told them that we were no longer going to give them Christmas presents, but we would do acts of service and love in their name. And we'd really appreciate it if they would do it the same in our name. And you'd be amazed after that initial pushback how they latch on that that's a good idea. Now, in true confession, my wife hasn't agreed to do this yet for the grandkids. So we've got another level to go yet. But there are biblical roots to doing this. This idea of giving away material presents and material wealth at Christmas has absolutely nothing to do with following the way of Jesus. I know that that's going to strike you as a horrible upset of the traditions we have, but there's biblical to it. Let's go back to Isaiah, the 1st chapter, the 17th verse. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Rescue the oppressed. Defend the orphan. Plead for the widow. That's what it means to follow the way of Jesus. To care for those, to be compassionate, to help reach those in poverty and lift them out. And what a better way to do it than in response to the climate crisis and the ever-escalating energy costs, we help people with energy-efficient lighting or improving their insulation or holding out the drafty winds of winter. Can you do that? Yeah, I think you can. And I think you'll find that your family will have a deeper meaning to Christmas than ever before. Because that's what God is calling us to be. A people rooted in compassion and love. So this Christmas, skip the presents. Don't even talk about Black Friday. So now in this session, we're going to look at that there's reason for hope because of human behavior, because of things that are happening. So let's go back to our central faith assertion. It comes to us from Psalm 24. And it flatly states, the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it. It's not ours, it's God's. It's not ours to consume or destroy, it's ours to care for, because God has given it into our care. So why is there reason for hope? Let's start with an old story. You remember the story of Jonah? Yeah, you do. You know how Jonah had God speak to him, saying, go at once to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come before me. And what does Jonah do? Jonah turns and goes the other way, exactly opposite of going to Nineveh. And we know all the troubles he got in for not doing what God had called him to do. Remember the sea voyage and the tremendous storm that threatened to kill everybody, and so the sailors threw him overboard. And then he's swallowed up by a great big fish. He's in the belly of the beast. And finally, he's puked up on ground, on dry land. He gets up and shakes himself off and finally goes to Nineveh to do what God has called him to do. Where's the hope in that story? Well, I got to tell you, in terms of the climate crisis for decades, the church has been Jonah, going the wrong direction. We have this call from God to awaken the world that the way we're living is destroying God's good creation, and we've gone the other way. You wonder why church isn't relevant to life anymore? Because people can't see any difference between how we live and the rest of the world lives that's destroying the world. So where's the hope? Here's the hope. There are more and more people of faith, like Jonah, picking themselves up off the dry land, shaking off that whale vomit, and heading to Nineveh.
I've been preaching on recently, and that's the scripture in Paul's second letter to Corinthians. At the kind of the climax, Paul is saying, let all that you do be done in love.
And why is that speaking to you?
Because I've come to the place where I think faith communities have potentially the most vital contribution to make in addressing climate change. And that is that we are the possessors of a rich language that fundamentally gets at what motivates people to act. And what motivates people to act are what I call the three great loves. A love of others, could be a love of neighbors, a love of God's creation, which often gets manifested in a sense of sacred obligation to a particular location. So we see that right now, obviously, in Standing Rock Reservation, but we see it also in other places. For us, when I was a pastor in Washington, the Columbia River was like kind of the sacred place for a lot of people. So,
what a Gaelic theologian would call a thin spot.
Yeah,
where
definitely.
You can tangibly feel the presence of God.
Right. And then the third great love, and this is what I find is the most common motivator, it's the biggest motivator for me, although it doesn't necessarily work for everybody, but it's a love of children and grandchildren. And so when you think of actual people bringing pictures to rallies and civil disobedience, right? Jim Antal would go to a civil disobedience with a blown up picture of his grandson.
Oh, yeah.
Just came from North Carolina, one of our leading clergy people down there, Steve Halstead. When he goes to a rally, he brings a picture of his grandson. And for me every day, what motivates me the most is my concern about my two daughters and the world they're inherit. And so,
what's the concern?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, is like right now what we're getting a glimpse of the United States. It's just that, a glimpse of what much of the rest of the world is already experiencing, and a glimpse of what we're going to be experiencing on a larger scale in the future. And so I'm concerned about the world they'll inherit. So I've come to the place where I feel like, one of the most fundamental acts of love that a parent or grandparent can have for their child is to do something to address the state of our climate. And I'd also say, what's that?
Why?
Well, I'll put it to you this way, that I believe as a parent that part of my job is to help provide food, shelter, clothing for my children. And along with those things, I believe it's part of my job is to secure a more hospitable, more safe world for my daughters to live in. What fundamentally motivates people, when I look not just at myself, but I look at other people who are active in addressing climate change, and I ask myself, what is motivating them to act? Pretty much almost always it relates to one of those three great loves.
Mm-hmm.
So
three great loves again are?
Love of others, neighbors both far and near, love of God's creation, and love of children and grandchildren, or the generation to come.
The most important thing for me in these Earth Avenger sessions is to help kids make the connections between the choices that they make and the impact on the world. So for example, we'll do a food map. Where I have the kids, we tell a story together, we draw it on a whiteboard about their favorite food and what happened to have to get that food to your plate. To recognize that they have power every day in the choices that they make to change a negative impact into a positive impact. If kids aren't connecting with nature, they're not going to care as much. And they're not going to realize their place in the story of life. So to help them understand the interconnectedness of all beings really helps to foster a sense of awareness and personal responsibility, hopefully. That's the hope. If they think they're separate from nature, then the issues they're hearing about or not hearing about with respect to climate change and environmental degradation, they're not going to care about it. They're not going to think that they have anything to do with it. Because it's important that they care about it, because we need everybody to do what they can to reduce our impacts on the earth, because the earth is suffering. God is sending us signals from across creation about our negative impact, and that we need to change our ways, and that starts with you and me and everybody. At the end of Earth Avenger sessions and the creation care workshops that I do for the confirmation retreats, I always refer back to our charge from God that we have dominion over the earth, and I always make sure to that they understand the definition of dominion as responsibility over, as opposed to power or control over, and that shifts the perspective.
Well, the first magical.
Have you ever thought about how our kids and our grandkids will look back on our time and wonder, what did you do when you first realized that the way you live was destroying my future? Will they remember us and bless our memories as people that once we understood took action? Or will they curse us? Because when faced with the greatest crisis that humankind has ever faced, we chose to turn away rather than engage. I want to raise an uncomfortable subject with us. I want to talk about the need to become a public witness, out in the public square, to leave our sanctuaries, to leave the safety of our church pews and go out in the public square and be the witness for Christ, to be the burning bush, if we want to go to the Old Testament, that sign that awakens our society that we have to change. I'm talking about participating in protests, carrying signs, or just being a presence, and even to the extent of being willing to risk arrest in nonviolent protests. It's time that the church becomes a visible sign to the world that we have to change how we're living, that we have to go to all renewable energy and quit burning that oil, that coal, and that gas. We have to do it with our physical presence. You know, the first time I got arrested, it was in D.C. in front of the White House in response to a call when the first day protesters got arrested and jailed over the weekend, and so we came. Ultimately, over 1,100 of us wound up being arrested. But it was a big step for me. I have to admit, I was uncomfortable doing it. And so I got down there one day ahead of time just to watch how this happened. And I had people coming up and asking me, what's going on? And I would explain. And their comment would be, wow, they look so nice. They're dressed in their Sunday best. How can they be willing to take this risk? How can we be willing to take this risk? It's not without its. Okay, the action item we're going to focus on today out of the 6, the one I want to specifically focus on, is going to be tough. We're now getting into the category where sometimes people will say, you know what, you're nuts if you think I'm going to do that. But this is where we need to go. What's 27? 27 is challenge your faith community to become a center for climate justice. Be a visible sign in your local community of those 48 steps that we've been going through and more. This is a tough action item. It's a call to be a center for climate justice to your faith community, very much like the call back in the 1800s to be a church that was against slavery. It's that kind of a critical justice issue. And so it's going to be unpopular. You're going to have pushback. You might even risk losing some major donors. People are going to threaten to pull their money out because they're heavily invested in fossil fuels. But you know, if it's wrong to destroy the earth, it's wrong to profit from that destruction. And so you're going to have to risk it. Why? In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus has a very discomforting passage on what it means to be a follower of him. He says this, Then Jesus told his disciples, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? It's not easy to follow the way of Jesus. When faced with the greatest crisis that humankind has ever faced, that threatens the very existence of future generations, the church must be a prophetic voice, and that's the challenge. I know at this point in time you've been getting the message. If you're still with us at this point in time, you're starting to understand that this is what God is calling you to do. It's not a one-off. It's not a one and done. This is a forever path that you need to challenge your church to be fully engaged in. Can you do it? Until next time, enjoy the journey. I'm your host, Reverend Dr. Terry Gallagher. See you further along the way.